All right. How'd that exam go? Does it feel better than the last one? Hopefully good. Yeah, that's usually what I find is that people find the second one easier because you basically get used to the tests for this class. So, alrighty. So what we're going to start talking about now is the trait approach. And so the idea of, are there such things as personality traits? And so maybe not surprisingly, the vast majority of what we'll read says yes. But we're also going to read about some folks who say no, personality traits are not a thing. So we'll hit both as we go through. This is one of the most influential approaches in American psychology in general. And what's really interesting is, like the theories we've talked about thus far, there's not really one central figure. There's not a Freud, there's not a Rogers. So this is called a whole bunch of different things: trait theory, dispositional theory, attribution theory. So disposition is the qualities that people carry around with them, the qualities that belong to them, that are somehow part of them. So the idea is, what are you disposed to do? And your disposition disposes you to do that. The idea is that there's consistency and continuity with dispositional traits. We have some sort of structure that creates our personality and guides our actions. So, do you act the same in every single situation? What do y'all think? See some shaking heads, right? Yeah. When I took this class in undergrad, Michael Levine said, if you act exactly the same in every situation, you may be seriously mentally ill, right? So imagine going to a party at one of the townhouses, right? Pulling up to the kitchen table, taking out your notebook. So raising your hand, right? You'll be like, we have something, we send her home, right? Yeah, you don't act the same. You're not the same in every single situation. But at a fundamental level, you're the same person. Regardless of acting, again, slightly differently in different situations, as situations require, we tend to adjust our behavior to the situation, but within the parameter of what we find consistent with our personality, but also what we find acceptable. So the attribution part of attribution theory is why people do the things they do. So again, as we've talked about in this class so far, people have this fundamental drive to figure out why for things. And in particular, as social beings, we love to figure out why other people are doing what they're doing, right? And so people's explanations for their own behavior and other people's behavior are attributions. The way people behave and why they're behaving that way is often ambiguous. So people tend to try to give explanations, to try to figure it out. So an example here might be friendliness. So when someone's friendly, what do we tend to think about them? What are some attributions or traits we tend to think about them? They're kind. Yeah. Extroverted, right? We're gonna go to the big five. Yeah. And so let's think about these different situations. How would a friendly person act at a party? Yeah, engage with others. Yeah, engage with other people. Yeah, talkative. They're not going to be the wallflower, right? Yeah. What about if they see a stranger who's upset? Yeah. Probably try and ask them what's wrong. Yeah, reach out and ask what's wrong. Yeah. Try to help in some way. If they're at a restaurant with people sitting at a table, what might they do? Make small talk, right? Actually, like talk to the other people. They won't be this person, right? How about if they're walking down our main thoroughfare of campus here, from here to Greer? What might they do? Yeah, exactly. This is the person who'll be like, "Hey, how you doing?" Right? It reminds me of when I was in grad school one homecoming weekend. My folks and I jumped on like a tour bus at the campus because I really only knew the psychology building. And the guy who was like the tour guide was just like the friendliest guy ever. And every person he saw, he was like, "Go Flashes," because that was our mascot. So yeah, I just think of the Go Flashes guy. How about if they have a friend who disagrees with them? What will the friendly person try to do?
They'd be respectful and like agree to disagree without like spoiling their friendship.
Yeah, so they'll try to work it out, or yeah, agree to disagree, figure some things can't be worked out, but we can still be friends. So if we looked at all these situations without thinking about friendliness, all of the behaviors might seem a little bit different. But if we use friendliness as a connection for all of these, we see that they're really not that different. So there are two big points to keep in mind here. The trait approach is based entirely on empirical research. And it's mostly correlational studies. And the emphasis here is on how do we accurately measure traits. So a lot of this is tied up with and intersects with the assessment chapter we talked about before. There's also a focus on individual differences. And so the idea here is not we're going to blanket explain everyone's behavior like a Freudian psychosexual stages. The idea is we're going to try to explain why people are different. So there are some strengths and weaknesses to that approach, as you can imagine. A big strength is that we're assessing and attempting to understand how and why people differ. But a weakness is that we're not thinking about the aspects that might be common to all people, right? There are a lot of things that humans share in common. And this approach isn't really going to look at those. Now, in terms of the measurement of individual differences, again, big focus of this method. So an interesting quote here, every man, and we could insert person here, right, is in certain respects, like all other men, like some other men, and like no other man. So in other words, like all other men, some properties and processes are universal. And what I just talked about, this approach doesn't really do a good job looking at, right? There are some things that all humans kind of share. Like some other men, really is the focus of the trait approach, the second level. So some properties differ between people, but there are sort of these traits we can look at and we can kind of group people based on those and understand people based on those. And like no other men, every individual is unique. And there's a lot of that in trait approach if we think about like constellations of traits. But again, as I said, we're really focusing on this like some other men. How can we look at traits and know things about people based on the traits they have? The trait approach sees traits as the building blocks of personality in the same way that DNA is the building blocks of life. So one of the names that's associated here is Goulart and Allport. And again, there's not going to be one big name, but there will be several who have been influential. He's the closest thing we have to a trait theorist. The really interesting thing is, although I'm talking about traits in a theories of personality class, there's not one overarching theory behind this, other than traits exist and we can like define people by them. But Allport really tried to look at this. He's an American experimental psychologist, and he was fascinated with the structure of personality. So he said people have predictable urges and behaviors and thoughts, and these characterize them. They make up their character. And so this is his really fancy definition. Certainly don't have to memorize this, but interesting to see how psychologists write. So he says a trait is a generalized and focalized neuropsychic system peculiar to the individual, with the capacity to render many stimuli functionally equivalent and to initiate and guide consistent equivalent forms of adaptive and expressive behavior. So basically this fancy hullabaloo is this slide, right? That you've got some stuff that's going to make you behave in consistent ways across different situations. The idea is that trait is this like central dispositional concept, and that it's organized into like habits, traits, and types. And again, Allport is the most theoretical person we have here. What we'll see as we go through our lecture and talk about traits is that largely the way that we arrive at ideas about traits is using statistical methods like factor analysis, rather than proposing a particular theory. So Cattell is another guy who's a big name in traits. He's also just a big name in stats in general. He defined a trait as a relatively permanent and broad reaction tendency. So the idea is this is consistent over time and also across situations. How you're going to react to things is going to be consistent from when you're a child to when you're an older adult, and also consistent across different situations. He argued that traits are types rather than on a continuum. He said there has to be some discontinuity among traits. There have to be distinct clusters of traits on sets and on people. And he said there's nothing in between. You either basically like are a type or you're not. However, in his exact same book, he defined a type, a personality type, as a pattern of traits. So we have some circular logic, right? And this is what happens when you try to theorize about traits, right? So he sees a trait as a characteristic, a place on the dimension, not the dimension itself. This is not the modern interpretation of traits. The modern interpretation of traits is that they are on continua. Another guy here, H.H. Kelly. A lot of psychology over time, particularly cognitive psychology, is influenced by the technology of the time. So in the 70s, when we had what a lot of people called the cognitive revolution, where people were really starting to think about like, how do our brains remember? How do our brains learn? We saw that our brains as analogous to computers, because computers were really starting to come into their own in the 70s. And so H.H. Kelly kind of comes from that perspective and says, if people were just logical information processors like a computer, there are three kinds of information. So consensus. Do all people respond the same way to a stimulus or a situation? So it kind of goes back to like all other men, right? Do all people respond this way to the stimulus or situation? And this gives us a focus on inter-individual similarities and differences. So between individual. Consistency is, does this person act this way over time? So now we're talking intra-individual consistency, consistency within the same person. And then distinctiveness. Does the person respond this way only to one particular stimulus, one particular object, one particular person? And so now we're looking at cross-situational consistencies. And H.H. Kelly said, if personality traits are a thing, and they're really dictating how we think, feel, behave, right? Then what we should be doing is making what are called internal and stable attributions. Things are happening because of something inside the person that isn't going to change over time. And he said, we'll make these attributions if consensus is low, so people are not all the same, right? If consistency is high, so an individual is acting the same across situations, is our Casper the Friendly Ghost, right? And distinctiveness is low. That this is not distinct to one situation. Again, they're acting different situations in a consistent manner over time. So Kelly argued that personality, the concept of personality, and especially if we think about it in terms of traits, is intended to capture consistency, stability, and individual differences. So it should be consistent across situations, stable over time, but we should also see differences between individuals. If every person is the same, why bother studying personality? Be a pretty boring field. We would have like solved everything that quick, right? Yeah.
So as you're going through like the consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness, we were kind of like going through different types of consistency, right? Like,
So yeah.
because I don't know if you said our first one for consensus, but like consistency is like the intra consistency.
Yeah, and like consistency is like over time, and then distinctiveness, low distinctiveness is like consistency over different situations.
Right.
Yeah,
So
good
what was,
question.
what was the consensus?
So consensus would be consistency across people.
Okay.
Like, does everybody act the same way? Great question. And I kind of love that way of framing it, like different types of consistency. Yeah, and so the idea is that not every person will act in the same way, will act consistently. But if personality traits are a thing, people will act the same way over time, and they'll act the same way over different situations. So, okay, we have this idea of traits, right? Sort of abstractly. How do we decide what's a trait? And if a given trait is a trait? Well, this comes down to the concept of construct validity. And basically, construct validity is a lot of, if not the majority of, what goes on, not only in personality psychology research, but in psychological research in general. So construct validity is the process of trying to prove that an idea about what something is, in this case, a personality trait, can actually predict what people will do in the future. So can our knowledge about a psychological construct predict future human behavior? That's the essence of dispositional theory. If we know someone's personality traits, we can do what we just did with our little friendliness exercise. Here's how they'll act in situation A. Here's how they'll act in situation B. Right, and sometimes these predictions are more like abstract, kind of for fun, right? And sometimes these become vital, right? If someone who has traits of psychopathy is in this situation? What is the likelihood they will be violent and harm someone, right? These become very important questions for psychologists to answer. To remind us what a construct is, right? Because it's been a while since we talked about this in our first lecture. It's an idea, it's a concept, it's a perception. And it's put together by a psychologist, a theorist, right? It's something that we study. A measurement device, and oftentimes in psychology, these are questionnaires measuring a given trait. That measurement device has construct validity to the extent that the measurement device enables us, allows us to support predictions made on the basis of the theory in which the construct being measured is embedded. So even though there might not be an abstract trait theory, for particular traits, there will be individualistic theories, right? So again, psychopathy is kind of an easy one, right? Because we're all familiar with serial killers and things like that, right? The concept of psychopathy has a lot of theory around it. And that's what, based on that theory, people have created things like the psychopathy checklist, which allows you to sort of diagnose someone as having antisocial personality disorder. And then that is predictive of, will this person manipulate people? Will this person kill people? Will this person take advantage of other people? We can also think about this in a more common way that we might be working within a therapeutic context. If I know someone has particular depressive traits, can I predict whether they will attempt to die by suicide, right? And whether I need to take action to protect them until we can get them feeling better. A lot of particularly clinical work can end up being risk management, risk assessment. And the idea is if we can pinpoint these traits, get really good measurements of them, that allows us to predict future behavior and protect our clients and those around our clients. So now we got a bunch of wordy definitions, so bear with me. So construct validity is a construct is not directly observable and known only by the network of laws in which it occurs. This network is termed a nomological net. So essentially, we define a construct by kind of figuring out how to measure it. And in 1995, Cronbach and Meehl argued that the process of test validation is in principle open-ended. So they said, you've got an assessment in the questionnaire that measures a particular trait. You basically always need to be checking to make sure that you're still measuring it well. It consists of developing and evaluating a theory about what scores on the test actually mean. And in this sense, the process of construct validation is formally identical with the investigation and elaboration of this nomological network in which the construct is embedded. Blah, 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 right? Psychologists like to be really wordy. Some psychologists love to use giant SAT words, right? What the heck does this mean? By examining the construct validity of the assessment instrument that measures a trait, again, it's typically a questionnaire, we can determine if that trait is really a trait. So by doing research about the instrument, it informs us about the trait itself. And so a lot of personality research then is wrapped up in assessment. So like the personality research lab at my grad school researched the MMPI. So which just gets you a whole bunch of personality information, a whole bunch of different traits, right? So how do we decide if a trait measure works? So this will look pretty familiar to the scientific method we looked at, right, when we were talking about research. And so this is how we figure it out. So you have some sort of theory about that particular trait. Again, let's think about certain depressive symptoms, let's think about something like hopelessness, right? That is something that we know very strongly predicts suicidality. So we've got some assumptions about that. If someone is very high in hopelessness, they are more likely to try to die by suicide. We'll have principles related to that. It is not good to just allow our clients to die by suicide, right? This is like a fundamental belief within psychology that part of our job is to try to keep our clients alive. And maybe related constructs as well. Based on that, we're going to come up with specific predictions and hypotheses. Well, at the same time, we're looking at measurement. Are we going to create a questionnaire that measures hopelessness? Is it more important to do this in an interview so you can see behavioral things while you're asking the questions? Right? And are those behavioral observations part of it, or is that a separate thing? Like, so for example, for kids with ADHD, there are like observational checklists, and those can be like the most helpful diagnostic things, right? Because a lot of the times it's the behaviors rather than the kid being able to articulate their symptoms. And that's all going to go into our research. So we're going to go out with this new measurement questionnaire, try to predict if someone scores high on this, are they going to express suicidality? Are they going to attempt to die by suicide? So we're going to have some sort of methodology, like giving it to everybody who comes in the clinic with a potential depressive diagnosis, right? And then we're going to have research findings. Based on those research findings, we might realize we need to refine our questionnaire. Maybe there are some items that just aren't contributing to our predictive abilities, so to that construct validity. Or maybe we're missing something fundamental about the traits, about the construct, and we need to add in items that get at that. We also might need to revise our theory, right? Maybe this trait of hopelessness in isolation isn't going to be predictive enough. Maybe we need to be looking more conceptually at depressive cognitions, something along those lines. Or maybe we need to narrow in even more. And so this is, like I mentioned, essentially a lot of the research that's done in social psychology, personality psychology, clinical psychology is, can I create a good measurement that will allow me to predict things and thus best serve my clients? Or maybe in a more abstract way, if I figure out that I can predict things, can that inform future prevention programs, future therapies, right? Future just knowledge in the abstract that might then inform those things. And so creating new measurements, refining them, sometimes comparing them. So for example, there are multiple measures of depression out there. Am I going to do a clinical interview? Am I going to do a questionnaire? Is it more advantageous to use both? Do I have better construct validity, better predictive ability if I do that? And so refine. And again, as I mentioned, like the MMPI lab at my grad school, they don't just rest and are like, yay, the MMPI is good, check, right? Like they're forever doing research on, can we make it adaptive? Like do it on a computer, and if you answer this question, you don't have to answer these 5 questions, make it shorter. Or are there items we don't need to put in there? So like the MMPI-3, they added items about eating disorders because they realized in its almost 100-year history at this point in time, they've never measured that, and a lot of people experience that, right? And so it's never resting on your laurels, always trying to make our research better, our things more precise. It's why they didn't stop after we had the X-ray, right, in medicine. They came up with the CT scan. And then they're like, that's not quite good enough. Let's come up with the MRI, right? And then let's come up with the functional MRI so we can see like a video of people's brains instead of just like static brain. So sometimes people will look at this and be like, who cares? Like, why are we getting bogged down in all this, right? What is the point of measuring traits? Well, traits predict behavior. And traits can be used to understand behavior. And I have a like, why do you think this is important up here? I think you all know that essentially psychology is the study of human behavior, right? So like this is the fundamental underlying imports of our entire field. And so this becomes really something vital to focus on. One thing I forgot to say when we were on this slide is the reason we have to do this process is that the construct itself is not directly observable. It's known only by this process, and this process is cumulative over time. We can't just look at someone and be like, suicidal, right? I don't have something like a brain scan or a like UPC scanner, right? Where I can just go, boop, right? Intelligent, right? And so we've got to find kind of almost roundabout ways to get at these things. And this is why things like meta-analyses are important, because you look at this stuff over time. So there are different ways that you look at this in the context of research. And one of them is the single trait approach. So you might have a researcher who built essentially their entire career on studying one trait. This happened with the guy who developed that hair psychopathy checklist. Like he developed that for his dissertation. And then that was his whole career, towards refining it, doing research on psychopathy, right? What else is related to it? And so what you're asking in the single trait approach is, what do people with a certain personality trait do? And you are often examining correlations between one trait and many behaviors. So an example here is authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is turning your will over to an external authority to avoid having to make personal choices. The idea from authoritarianism was based in the atrocities of Hitler and the Nazis. Basically, how could people just let these things happen? How could everyday folks like those in this room decide, yeah, no problem, I'm gonna put people in concentration camps and gas them to death, right? People who are high on authoritarianism enjoy giving orders, which they expect to be followed without question. They tend to be prejudiced against minority groups. These folks tend to be anti-democratic. They do not want a democratic process. They want to follow like a strong leader. They're also pseudo-conservative, and pseudo-conservative means that they accept conventional and traditional values and also accept destructive values. Cynicism, punitiveness, violent prejudices, right? Whether that's anti-Semitism, whether that is racism, sexism, what have you. So there is a scale called the California F that measures this. That is the questionnaire, the methodology by which they can measure authoritarianism. And the F stands for fascism. So this measures the 9 facets of authoritarianism. And this slide shows some of what they found from that research. That people in terms of behaviors tend to be extremely deferential and respectful to people with higher power. They'll kind of go along with what they say without questioning anything. But they tend to be rude and disrespectful to anyone they perceive as having lower power than themselves. People who score high on this do not respond well to challenges about their seemingly inconsistent behaviors and values. They tend to be uncooperative and inflexible. And they experience fewer positive emotions, which you know is linked to psychopathology like depression. And they support what they perceive as strong political candidates. This is more than just going along with statements regardless of their content. They're not just acquiescing here. This is an individual difference construct that can be used to explain why individuals or which individuals would be most likely to follow a fascist leader like Hitler. And it's a good example of how one personality trait, authoritarianism, can be used to understand a really complex social phenomenon. And some of this might be like resonating with you all in a very different way right now. I'm just realizing there are pockets of our culture that are really high on authoritarianism right now. So that's the single trait approach. You also have folks who do research in this realm who are using a many trait approach. So the idea here is maybe we focus on one behavior and we say, who does that behavior? Who does this important behavior? And so you'll examine the correlations between that one behavior and many traits. This is essentially the research I do. So I do a lot of research on risk and protective factors for disordered eating, right? And so you could look at disordered eating behaviors as my one behavior. And then I'm looking at a bunch of traits like internalization of the thin ideal, self-objectification, body dissatisfaction, right, as predictors of that. And my ideal is to figure out, like, what's a good way to prevent this? If we can figure out how to change some of those ideas. There is this questionnaire, and I have like assessment instrument. Like you said, it's not quite a questionnaire, called the California Q-Set, that has 100 personality descriptions, and they're more complex than single word traits. They do like little definitions, essentially. So some example items here is unpredictable and changeable in behavior and attitudes. Is a talkative individual. Is vulnerable to real or fancied threat, generally fearful. And so then you have people sort these into a forced choice, symmetrical, and normal distribution. And then you compare these characteristics within an individual. And that's really abstract and hard to wrap your head around. And so we're going to talk instead, the example here of delay of gratification. Oh, sorry, Alex.
So is the California Q-Set more, is it just like S data, or is it also like informant based?
That's a really good question. It's informant based. And so what a Q-Set is like, you have like categories they have to sort things in, they look at the card and they put them in there. So it's like a physical Likert scale, and like you get different responses because of that. But yeah, it's, yeah, you kind of get both. It's an interesting way of thinking about it. Good question. So the behavior of delay of gratification involves denying yourself immediate pleasure for long-term gain. And the best way to illustrate this, and some of you have probably seen this video before, but is with something they do with kids called the marshmallow test.
Attention. All right, here's the deal. Marshmallow for you. You can either wait, and I'll give you another one if you wait, or you can eat it now. When I come back, I'll give you another, so then you'll have to. And stay in here, stay in the chair till I come back, okay? All right.
So it's called delay of gratification because if the kiddo can wait, and I don't think it's very long, like 5-10 minutes before eating the marshmallow, they'll get two, right? So you're delaying instant gratification of eating the marshmallow for a better reward down the line.
It'll be something, and I'll come back. Half an hour. Okay. Something clean, and then I'll come back, okay? You can either eat it right now or you can wait, either way, okay?
It's just not even waiting.
I can do. You did good? You did? You wanted to eat it, didn't you? Yeah. But I think I'd give you another one. Okay, I can have both.
So that's delay of gratification. Can you make yourself wait for something good? And go through something not so good in the meantime? You all are well versed at delay of gratification because you are going through 4 years to get a piece of paper. Right, sitting in this class listening to me drone on every day, right? As well as your other professors. Oh, sorry, we're gonna cover this slide. On let's say Wednesday, Friday. So delay of gratification, we do have some really interesting research. So we know that it's harder for boys to delay than girls, despite what we saw in that video where the girls were more likely to just dive in. And when girls are able to delay gratification, so they've done this with girls ages 3 to 11, it correlates with a lot of different traits like intelligence, competence, attentiveness, and resourcefulness. In boys ages 3 to 11, those who are able to delay gratification, that behavior is correlated with shyness, quietness, compliance, and anxiousness. It correlates with other things in both, like planfulness, reflectiveness, and reasonableness. We know there are traits like ego control, which is essentially being able to just like monitor and moderate yourself in general. That's related to the delay of gratification in both boys and girls. Ego resiliency, which is essentially your ability to kind of like bounce back when like there's a bunch of horrible stuff your way. It's related to delay of gratification, but only in girls. And they think the differences there may be based more on societal expectations. We know that delay of gratification or lack thereof is linked to substance abuse. And it's predicted by several characteristics that are rated as early as 10 years prior to the person actually developing substance abuse issues. We know that depression There are risk factors for women for depression that include over control and being shy and reserved. Whereas for men, the risk factors for depression include under control and being more aggressive, less social. And those are all also linked to delay of gratification. Alrighty, we are going to stop there for today. Folks on Zoom, I've got you all, so you're good to go. And like I said, on Friday, we will pick back up where we left off. And tomorrow I am still in like my lots of advising era, but hopefully early next week I'll be able to start grading your exams.